Hi, this is Paul, and I'm continuing to walk through the Heidelberg Catechism. Lord's Day 4 is, for many people, a difficult Lord's Day in the Catechism. And in my experience, people tend to react to these three question and answers depending on a lot about how they are feeling about the world around them. If life is going pretty well and they feel that they're being treated well by people in their life, this sounds rather dark. But if in fact they are being poorly treated by people around them, then these sound quite sane. One of the things that I talk about often in my Sunday school classes and sometimes in my sermons is what I call the great puzzle. The great puzzle is the fact that this world, on one hand, is full of tremendous beauty, and on the other hand, a place where we can suffer greatly. And consciousness is a sort of thing where when the sun is out and things are well, everything is good. And then when things go poorly or we're not feeling well or depressed, then things are bad. And part of the difficulty about being a human being is that our emotions rise and fall. Now, we need our emotions because our emotions tell us things that we need to know in order to live. But it's easy to become subject or slaves to our emotions and then to sort of project the world out there. Psychologists talk about this dynamic of projection, and there's a tremendous amount of truth to it in that if you come across a grumpy person and you ask them the state of the world, you'll get a dark answer. If you come across a person who's doing well and you ask them about the state of the world, you'll get a light answer. Now, the state of the world isn't necessarily impacted by their emotions. It might be impacted by their actions, but not impacted by their emotions. And their take is usually dependent on how are they feeling. Now, I just finished a sermon on the golden calf in Exodus 32. And what you find in the book of Exodus is a very realistic take on human beings. Now, every story has to sort of be told from a perspective. And if you read the book of Exodus, the main characters are Moses and God. And there are some other more minor characters along the way. Moses' family, Pharaoh is a big character. But the people are sort of a character in and of themselves. And this is common in a number of biblical books because the idea there is that people in groups and then sometimes individually are sort of a certain way. They're fickle. They can do amazing things and they can do horrible things. And sometimes the same person can do both amazing and horrible things. It's not uncommon to find that in people. In fact, well, one of my favorite treatments of this is from a man called Miroslav Volf, who wrote a book called Exclusion and Embrace. I read this book a number of years ago. He wrestled with the concept of hell. One of the observations he makes in the book is that people who have very comfortable lives and who have not suffered atrocities, either major genocides or maybe the kinds of dark stories of abuse that happen in people's homes, they sort of lose a sense of God's punishment and God's right to punish. But Miroslav Volf grew up in what was Yugoslavia when the communist bloc was in control of it. And when the communists lost power, it broke up into these various little sub-nations, many of which had had years and years of bitter enmity, and it was sort of just covered by the brutality of the Soviets. And once Yugoslavia was breaking up, they had a civil war. And some of you who are as old as I am can remember stories of atrocities coming out of the Balkans. We have the internet. You can go and read them if you want. But they had everything, ethnic cleansing. Miroslav Volf made the observation that part of what happened in communist Soviet atheism was that if in fact there is no afterlife, and if in fact there is no God, then suddenly people get very insistent on settling the scores here and now. And that becomes a difficult thing because, for example, let's say you are a very well-known tyrannical dictator who has caused the loss of lives and the suffering of millions and millions of people. You can think of some of the most well-known names of the 20th century, Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin or Chairman Mao or Pol Pot. He was really sort of a minor one. Cambodia was a small country compared to China, the Soviet Union, or Nazi Germany in World War II and the Holocaust. Remember, 6 million Jews lost their lives, but 6 million other people did too. These men caused the death and suffering of many, many people. You have the question, well, how can justice be settled? Now, certainly you can find those who collaborated and participated with these great atrocities. But can you actually somehow settle the score just with one shallow human being's life? Well, how old was Hitler when he was hiding in his bunker as the Russians were gobbling up Germany east of Berlin? Was he in his, I could look it up, I guess, but I don't really care because the number doesn't really matter. Late 50s, early 60s. Let's say you managed to keep Hitler alive and somehow in torture give him the maximal amount of torture that you could, while at the same time extending his life as far as you could. Would that settle the score? For the millions and all of the various levels of suffering that he was responsible for perpetrating? Now, of course, he was not alone. There are many, many others with him. And there are many, many others who we would think would be, well, probably pretty good people, except for the circumstance. This segment of misery in the Heidelberg Catechism, when it talks about human beings, talks about our capacity. And while all of us, praise God, have known some good people in our lives, and maybe even some heroic people in our lives, one of the facts about human misery and suffering is that it compounds in this world. That, in fact, one person, maybe a well-meaning person, makes a decision and an entire population of people suffers. If you're looking for a good book to read, Thomas Hager's The Alchemy of Air is a fascinating read. The subtitle is A Jewish Genius, a Doomed Tycoon, and the Scientific Discovery That Fed the World and Fueled the Rise of Hitler. Towards the end of the 19th century, world leaders were increasingly concerned about the world's capacity to feed its 1+ billion people, because farmland was depleted. And while you could use natural fertilizers like manure didn't provide anywhere near the scale of putting nitrogen back in the soil that the human population demanded. There were some islands off the coast of South America that were discovered to have thousands of years worth of guano on them, and they were being mined. And in fact, 2 South American countries fought a war over those islands because it was so valuable, because that was the only kind of fertilizer they had. And the reality is that we're surrounded by nitrogen all the time. Most of the air we breathe is nitrogen, but it doesn't get into the soil in the way that the soil needs in order to grow crops. And so what this scientist did was, well, he created a way to take nitrogen from the air. Here's talking about these islands. To take Franz Haber, to take nitrogen from the air and be able to turn it into a chemical and rejuvenate the soil. People guess that maybe the world could hold maybe 3 or 4 billion people and feed that many people. And of course, we're up above 8 billion now. And the reason that could be done was because we could make fertilizer from the nitrogen in the air. You know what else needed that nitrogen? Explosives. He was an ardent German nationalist, and as Germany faced the First World War, they needed munitions to fight the Allies, and so that helped too. He could do a lot of things. He was a brilliant chemist. He also made a particular kind of gas that could be used as a weapon, and so they had gas attacks to try to defend Germany. He also developed a kind of gas that a generation later would be used to gas Jews in Hitler's camps. It's an incredible story, and it's a tremendously tragic story, because this is how we are. When Jesus on the cross prays, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing," that's true. But so often we do know what we're doing. But doesn't God do us an injustice by requiring in his law what we are unable to do? That's a really tough question. And because the fact, we would like to imagine that keeping the law is just a matter of doing this and not doing that. And we would like to imagine that human beings are the kinds of creatures that, if I say I'm not going to do this, I will never do it. Any realistic assessment of how we are shows that there are often glimmers of good in the vilest of human hearts, but there are also capacities of evil in the best of us. Of course, Solzhenitsyn said the line between good and evil goes through every human heart. God created human beings with the ability to keep the law. They, however, provoked by the devil in willful disobedience, robbed themselves and all their descendants of these gifts. Now, again, this sounds terribly otherworldly and fantastical, but if you boil it down into, well, what we normally see about regular human beings, little Johnny did that. Why? Because of how he was raised. There's a transmission that gets going in us, and there's a civilizational transmission that happens, whereby our estimations of good, bad, right, and wrong are completely lost. Today, in many places, people like to look around and say, well, if I lived in such and such an era, I would not have participated in these heinous crimes. I'm deeply skeptical. I would imagine that 100 or 200 years from now, if the Lord tarries, people will look back at our age and they will say, I cannot believe the unenlightened moral values that California in the 2020s lived under. Now we look around and we say, oh, we don't own slaves, but, well, there's almost zero things that we do that we can't find a moral taint in. So much we don't even know that we're doing them. And somehow we want to say, oh, but surely we shouldn't be held liable for any of that. When in our same breath, we certainly hold Aztecs liable for human sacrifice, or antebellum plantation owners liable for human slavery, or soldiers liable for killing the fathers and sons and committing atrocities all around the world. throughout all of human history. Sin is something that compounds. Does God permit such disobedience and rebellion to go unpunished? Certainly not. God is terribly angry with the sin we are born with, as well as the sin we personally commit. Sin, in its broadest sense, means missing the mark. And if you were to see someone who, by virtue of to whom they were born and with whom they were born and by whom they were raised, did heinous crimes, we still hold them accountable. We have to. Now, we might say, I understand why that person molested all those children, because that person was molested themselves. But not everyone who is molested goes on to molest. They might go on to do other things. Who knows? Should God not hold scales to human history? Bill Maher had a conversation with Jordan Peterson, and Bill Maher basically says, I don't think anybody is held accountable for what they do. Didn't Saddam Hussein mostly get away with it? Who of us can tell? The irony is that even though we from afar might look and say, wow, maybe Saddam Hussein really does enjoy himself with all of his wealth, and we might go look at other people in history and say, Genghis Khan, got to rape all he wanted and have how many concubines and wives and have how much money and have how many lands and go and take whatever he wanted. Isn't in some ways all of the acquisition that they made an indication that they were trying to fill something empty inside? The truly content person doesn't have to rob, rape, steal, plunder, and conquer. It's only the mouth that has no end of eating. Cursed is everyone who does not observe and obey all the things written in the book of the law. I love reading the stories in the Old Testament. They are absolutely amazing. And they just keep reframing and changing the assumptions that we bring to this world. And so I just finished Exodus 32 with God delivers Israel from Egypt. They didn't even remember him. And first thing out of the gate, no, he brought us out here to be killed by Pharaoh's army. No, he brought us out here to die of thirst. No, he brought us out here to... So the tiny little seed planted in the garden, when the serpent says, isn't he holding back on you? Isn't he holding out on you? Sort of becomes a crop that the children of Israel harvest in the desert. Can't trust God. Then he shows up on the mountain and thunders the 10 Commandments, and they're like, no, shut him up. It's too much. God says, I want them to have some fear. Fear they have. But here's the thing about law and justice. You need them. You always need them. When I talk in my men's Bible study about the book of Deuteronomy, I say, right now people sort of popularly use the word karma. Bill Maher says, I don't think it exists. Of course, because with Bill Maher, everything's in this box. And if Bill Maher got deeply wronged, what evils wouldn't he be tempted to do? The book of Deuteronomy is in some ways very flat. Keep the covenant and God will bless you. Fail the covenant and God will curse you. And then, of course, things don't go so well for Israel. And, well, isn't that the deal you wanted? I want to be in control of my life. If I do good things, I want them always to bear fruit. Good. If you do bad things, do you want them always to be punished? Yes, until you begin to realize that the evils that you do, you're probably only half even conscious of. And so what to do then? And in fact, we live in this anxious age where this great article on the surprising Basically, the surprising return of guilt, where suddenly people are like, oh my goodness, I'm just living a normal American life and I'm destroying the planet. I almost can't help it. I need a car to go to work. What am I to do? And then we've had a moment in history where we've liked to sort of pile the atrocities of human history on subsequent generations and say, well, you're all responsible for that. Oh, can't go back in time and undo it. How can I make up for it? Should God just say, your daughter got raped. That's the way it goes. Bill Maher, that's kind of what he's left with. Well, there is no God, so all that's left is buy a gun and kill anyone who seems to threaten my family. Yeah. And it keeps going from there. But isn't God also merciful? God is certainly merciful, but also just. God's justice demands that sin committed against his supreme majesty be punished with a supreme penalty, eternal punishment of body and soul. And I know that's a tough thing. That's a tough one. But again, please tell me how you could exact from Hitler's natural body sufficient justice to balance the scales of everything done to him. What would that look like? And the truth is, we have no idea. We have no idea how to balance any of these things. Basically, Lord's Day 4 says, all of the suffering of humanity will not go unaddressed. Something has to address it. In Exodus 32, God and Moses kind of get into a fight. The Lord says to Moses, your people that you took out of Egypt. Moses turns around as a mediator and says, your people that you took out of Egypt, please relent. Don't kill them. I don't want to be the new Abraham. Then Moses goes down in the camp, kills 3,000 to restore order, and yet a plague comes. And Israel is sufficiently chastened by the stick to relent and confess and give in and try again. And good. It's good. They need to relent. God is fully within his rights to punish. And in fact, we need human governments that have the power of the sword to keep order and to punish. But what all of that shows is that we need a new heart. And somehow God is going to have to address us. It seems if you read the book of Exodus, it was way easier for God to make 10 plagues to get Israel out of Egypt. It was way easier for God to kill the firstborn of Egypt to get Israel out than to actually change the hearts of the children of Israel in the desert. Try and try and try. And the story goes through the Old Testament again and again and again. And someone says, I think people are basically good. And I think, you have lived a wonderful life, I'm sure. I think if you had different circumstances, you might think differently. People have an enormous capacity for good. They also have an enormous capacity for evil. And truth is, if we are blessed to live at a prosperous time and place with relatively good order and affluence, like we enjoy here in North America, and even some of us enjoy it way more than others, you might have that sunny disposition. But if you look over human history, I doubt you would say God should just shrug. Something has to happen. How can God actually live with the rebellion of his own creation? There's only 4 Lord's Days so far. 3 of them are in misery. It's pretty short. Because for the writers of the Catechism, they didn't feel the need to dwell on this. They lived in the 16th century. Famine was common. I'm sure childhood, infant mortality rates were horrendous. Everybody suffered, and they knew it. And they also knew much of their suffering was coming from other human beings, and they knew that too. And so the Catechism doesn't want to linger too long on misery. It basically says, yeah, misery, it'll find you. What we want to get on with is deliverance and then gratitude. So, hope this is helpful.